The canvas flap of the wagon snapped in the wind, a sound like a pistol shot in the unnerving quiet of the high country. Each time it whipped open, Elara Sterling caught another glimpse of the world that was to be her new home, and each time, her heart shrank a little more inside her chest. This was not a world made for people. It was a place of raw, jagged power, a landscape that did not ask for admiration, only demanded survival. The Colorado Rockies rose on all sides like the teeth of a saw, sharp and cruel against a sky the color of old steel. Below the treeless peaks, vast dark forests of pine and spruce crowded the slopes. So dense they seemed to swallow the thin afternoon light whole. They drank the light and breathed out a chilling silence, a quiet so profound it felt like a weight upon the ears. The only sound was the perpetual, lonely cry of the wind as it scoured the canyons, a mournful song of emptiness. Elara pulled her woolen shawl tighter, the fine Boston fabric feeling flimsy and foolish in this colossal wilderness. She was a creature of manicured parks, of gas lamps casting a civilized glow on cobblestone streets, of the gentle lapping of water against the harbor piers. Her life had been a carefully arranged thing, a collection of quiet rooms and predictable seasons. This place, this immense and brutal emptiness, was not a new chapter. It felt like a cage, the grandest and most terrifying prison she could ever have imagined. Barely 3 months had passed since the wedding. 3 months since she had stood in the parlor of her family's home, the scent of dying roses heavy in the air, and given her hand to Alistair Sterling. He was a man twice her age, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and left out in the cold. His fortune, made in the unforgiving world of shipping, had been the salvation of her family, a bulwark against the ruin that had loomed after her father's disastrous investments. The marriage was a transaction, a piece of human collateral to settle a debt. She understood that. What she had not understood was the sheer, suffocating loneliness that would come with it. Her memory of her husband was a collection of stark, unpleasant sensations. The dry, cool touch of his hands, which held her as if she were a porcelain doll he had purchased but did not quite know what to do with. The scent that clung to his clothes, a mixture of expensive cigars and faint, constant disapproval. And his eyes, gray and flat as a winter sea, which looked upon her not with affection, but with the cool appraisal of a man assessing a recent acquisition. There was no intimacy, no warmth, only the chilling finality of a bargain struck and sealed. A sharp voice cut through her reverie, pulling her from the gray landscape of her thoughts. "Elara, sit up straight. You look like a sack of meal slumped in there." Alistair. He had reined in his magnificent black gelding to ride alongside the wagon. The horse was a fine animal, powerful and impeccably groomed, much like its master. Alistair sat tall in the saddle, a man defined by an unshakable belief in his own control. He controlled his business with an iron will. He controlled the dozen rough men who made up their party, and he most certainly intended to control his young wife. She straightened her spine, forcing a neutral expression onto her face. "The air is thin. Alistair, I find it makes me tired." "Nonsense," he snapped, his voice crisp and impatient. "It is a weakness of spirit, not of the lungs. I am taking you to a new life, a place where a man's fortitude can build an empire from rock and ice. You should be filled with gratitude, with excitement. Instead, you mope and sigh like a consumptive poet. A Sterling woman must comport herself with dignity, even in this savage land, especially in this savage land. You are a reflection of me." He was not speaking to her. She realized, so much as issuing a directive. There was no room for her feelings in his world, only for her performance. The vast emotional gulf between them was as wide and uncrossable as the canyons that fell away from the narrow trail. He saw this land as another asset to be conquered, another line on his ledger. He had financed a new mining settlement deep in the mountains, a place he spoke of with a proprietary gleam in his eye. She was simply another possession he was transporting to his new kingdom. as he spurred his horse forward to bark an order at the lead driver. Alara's gaze drifted upward, past the plodding mule team, to the high ridge that ran parallel to their path. There, etched against the bruised sky, was a lone rider. He was not with their party. He sat perfectly still on a tough-looking Mustang, a silhouette of profound self-containment. She could not make out his features, only the impression of a man who was not an intruder on the landscape, but a part of it, as elemental as the rock and the wind. He wore a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and he seemed to be watching their slow, laborious progress with a detached patience. The wagon driver, a burly man named Jeb with a tobacco-stained beard, noticed her looking. He spat a brown stream of juice into the dust. "Don't you pay him no mind, ma'am," he grumbled, his voice low. "Just some half-Ute fella from the territories. Best to pretend you don't see his kind. They're like ghosts, best left alone." Alara saw the flicker of disdain in Jeb's eyes, heard the casual cruelty in his tone. The other men nearby shared the look. An outsider, a man who belonged nowhere. She looked back toward the ridge. The word the driver used was ugly, meant to diminish and dismiss. But what she saw in that distant figure was not savagery. She saw a solitude so complete it was almost majestic, a stillness that seemed a world away from the noise and bluster of her husband and his ambitions, a flicker of something, not pity, but a strange, unbidden curiosity, stirred within her. Then the wagon rounded a bend, and the ridge and the lone rider were gone. The change in the weather came with the speed of a striking snake. One moment, the sky was the same monotonous steel gray it had been all day. The next, it began to darken, the color deepening to a bruised, menacing purple-black. The wind, which had been a constant, mournful companion, rose to a vicious howl, shrieking through the canyons and tearing at the wagon's canvas cover with invisible claws. The wagon master, a grizzled old man named Silas, who had crossed these mountains more times than he could count, rode back to Alistair, his face etched with concern. "Mr. Sterling," he shouted over the rising gale. "This is a bad one coming, a real blizzard. I can smell the ice in it. We need to find shelter now. There is an old trapper's lean-to about 2 miles back. We must turn around." Alistair wheeled his horse, his expression a mask of contemptuous disbelief. "Turn around. Do you know how much this delay will cost me? Old man, I will not be ruled by the superstitions of a hired hand. We are behind schedule as it is. We push on." "Sir, this ain't superstition," Silas pleaded, his voice ragged with urgency. "This is a killer storm. The trail ahead is narrow and exposed. We get caught out on that ledge, and we will be burying every last one of us come spring. I am paying you to drive, not to cower," Alistair said, his voice like the crack of a whip. "Now get back to your team and push them harder. I will not have my plans undone by a little snow." He turned his back on the old man, a final, arrogant dismissal. Alara watched from the wagon, a knot of pure ice forming in the pit of her stomach. She saw the grim resignation on Silas's face as he turned away, the fatalistic slump of his shoulders. In that moment, she understood that her husband's pride was a more dangerous force than any storm. It was a blind, deaf juggernaut, and they were all being dragged in its wake. The blizzard hit them not like a weather front, but like a physical assault. The sky vanished. The world was reduced to a churning, blinding vortex of white. The snow did not fall. It drove horizontally, a furious swarm of icy needles that stung any exposed patch of skin. Visibility dropped to nothing. Alara could no longer see the horse Alistair rode, though he was only a few yards away. She could barely make out the rumps of the mules directly in front of the wagon. The roar of the wind was deafening, a constant, insane shriek that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. The heavy wagon, which had felt so solid and secure, was now a toy, rocking and groaning under the onslaught. An intense, penetrating cold began to seep through the thick canvas, through her coat, through her skin, searching for the warmth of her heart. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her throat. They were crawling along the edge of a mountain, blind, in the heart of a hurricane of snow. Then came the scream. It was not human. It was the terrified, high-pitched shriek of a horse in pain. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Alara against the hard wooden frame. Shouts erupted outside, men's voices thin and desperate against the storm's fury. "The lead horse is down!" someone cried. "The trace is snapped!" Through the roar, she heard Alistair's voice, incandescent with rage. "You incompetent fool! Jeb, I told you to watch for ice!" The wagon tilted at a sickening angle. Alara scrambled for a handhold as the floorboards canted beneath her. There was a terrible splintering sound, the groan of tortured wood and snapping leather. The wagon was sliding. It had broken free from the rest of the team. For a heart-stopping second, it teetered on the edge of the unseen trail. And then, with a final, soul-wrenching lurch, it plunged into the white abyss. The fall was a chaos of noise and motion. The wagon tumbled end over end, splintering against the trunks of unseen pines, crashing against rocks buried in the snow. Alara was thrown about like a rag doll. The world was a spinning, jarring nightmare of impact and darkness. The last thing she felt was the canvas tearing open and the brutal, shocking impact of her body hitting something solid before she was flung out into the cold, silent whiteness. The wind was knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. When her senses swam back into focus, she was lying on her side, half buried in a deep drift of snow. Her fine traveling dress was torn at the shoulder, her bonnet lost. An agonizing pain throbbed in her ribs. Above her, somewhere up on the trail, she could hear the faint, panicked whinnying of the remaining horses and, more distantly, Alistair's shouting, his voice swallowed almost immediately by the howling wind. "Alistair!" she tried to call out, but her voice was a pathetic croak, a tiny puff of sound that went nowhere. She struggled to her feet, sinking to her thighs in the powder. The snow was falling so thickly she could not see more than 5 feet in any direction. The wagon lay a few yards away, a broken wreck of splintered boards and twisted iron, its contents scattered and already disappearing under a fresh blanket of white. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. "Alistair!" she screamed again, putting all her strength into it. The wind snatched the word from her lips and tore it to shreds. The sounds from above were growing fainter. They were moving on. Were they looking for her? Did they even know she had been thrown clear? A thought, colder and more terrifying than the wind itself, pierced through her dazed mind. Alistair was not a man to suffer a loss. A wagon, a mule, a hired hand. These were acceptable losses in the pursuit of his goal. What about a wife? A wife who had brought him no dowry of significance, only a respectable name to attach to his new money. The horrifying certainty washed over her that he might simply cut his losses. He would save himself, save what he could of his investment, and push on. He would mourn her, publicly and properly, but he would not risk his own life for her. The seed of that thought planted itself in her heart and began to grow, a root of pure, cold terror. Time ceased to have meaning. It was measured only in the deepening of the snow and the slow, inexorable leaching of warmth from her body. For what felt like hours, she struggled through the drifts, calling out until her throat was raw, her voice little more than a whisper. The hope of being found began to curdle, replaced by the primal, desperate struggle just to keep moving, to stay alive. A violent shivering took hold of her, shaking her body in uncontrollable spasms. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. This was the cold she had read about in books, a living entity that sought to invade and conquer. She stumbled on, her expensive leather boots, so practical on the streets of Boston, now sodden and useless. Her feet and hands went from aching to numb, a strange and alarming lack of sensation. Her mind began to drift. The roaring of the storm faded in and out, replaced by phantom sounds, the chime of a clock in her father's house, the clatter of carriages on Beacon Street. Her life back east felt like a story someone had once told her about a different person. A fragile girl in a silk dress who had never known what it was to be truly cold, truly alone. The shivering subsided, replaced by a deceptive, creeping warmth. A profound exhaustion settled over her, heavy as a lead blanket. It felt so pleasant, so inviting. This idea of just stopping, of lying down in the soft, white silence and sleeping. She knew, in some distant, rational corner of her mind, that this was the most dangerous feeling of all, the final lie the cold told its victims. But she was too tired to fight it anymore. She found a large outcropping of rock that offered a meager shield from the direct blast of the wind. She slumped down behind it, curling herself into a small ball. The will to fight, the last flicker of her spirit, was fading. She was so very tired. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the encroaching white oblivion, letting the heavy peace of the snow settle over her. Just as the last vestiges of her consciousness were dissolving into the whiteout, a shape materialized before her. It was a dark, solid form in a world that had become nothing but swirling gray and white. For a moment, she thought it was a bear, or perhaps an angel of death come to claim her. The figure knelt beside her. It was Cale. He had seen the wagon go over the side from the ridge. He had watched the disorganized party above. Seeing their panic, their indecision, he knew these mountains. And he knew this kind of storm. He knew that no one would survive for long down in that ravine. It was not a thought born of compassion, so much as a simple, hard fact of this land. So he had made his way down, his Mustang picking its way sure-footedly through the blinding snow. He found her huddled behind the rock, a small, dark shape, almost completely covered by the accumulating drift. Her face was as pale as porcelain, her lips a faint, bloodless blue. A delicate tracery of ice crystals clung to her eyelashes. He thought, for a moment, that he was too late, that she was already dead. He pulled off his thick leather glove and pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, searching for a pulse beneath the frozen skin. For a second, there was nothing. Then he felt it. A faint, thready flutter. A life, fragile and stubborn, still beating against the overwhelming cold. He did not hesitate. There were no words, no romantic pronouncements. There was only the stark calculus of survival. She was a life, and the instinct to preserve it was as deep in him as bedrock. He took off his own worn, heavy sheepskin coat, the wool inside still holding the warmth of his body, and wrapped it carefully around her limp form. Then, with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of hardship and strength, he lifted her into his arms. Her body was a dead weight, her head lolling against his shoulder. He settled her against his chest and turned his face into the wind. Somewhere, miles through this blinding blizzard, was a small, dark shape he knew was there, a place of shelter he had built with his own hands, his isolated line cabin. It was the only sanctuary in this entire frozen, God-forsaken wasteland. And so he began to walk, a lone man against the fury of the storm, carrying the unconscious bride. 2 worlds, one of opulent parlors and the other of lonely ridges, had collided in a tragedy of ice and snow, stripped of everything but the most basic, desperate need to survive. The first sound to pierce the deep oblivion was the gentle crackle of a fire. It was a homey, comforting sound. And for a moment, Ilara thought she was in her father's study in Boston, curled in the big leather chair with a book. Then came a soft hissing, like water meeting hot stone, and beneath it all, a low, constant moan, the sound of a great beast in pain. The wind. The beast was the wind, and it was trying to claw its way inside. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was low, made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. A fire danced in a stone hearth set into one wall, its flickering light casting long, wavering shadows. She was lying on a narrow cot, buried under the scratchy weight of a wool blanket and the immense, heavy warmth of a buffalo hide. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, something wild and clean. A deep, agonizing ache pulsed in her hands and feet. It was not a sharp pain, but a thick, burning throb, as if her very bones were on fire. She tried to move her fingers, and a cry escaped her lips. The pain was immense, a searing torment that brought tears to her eyes. A figure moved by the fire, startling her. It was the man from the ridge, Cale. He turned, his face half hidden in shadow, half illuminated by the firelight. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived entirely alone, where no energy was ever wasted. He did not hover or fuss over her, but she could feel his awareness of her, a silent, watchful presence. Panic, cold and familiar, fluttered in her chest. She was alone with him, this stranger, this man her driver had dismissed with a sneer. Her mind, foggy with fever and pain, raced with all the terrible stories she had ever heard, tales whispered in Boston parlors about savage men who lived in the wilderness, men without law or God. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and the fire in her extremities forced her back down. He came toward her then, carrying a steaming tin cup. He knelt by the cot, not too close, and held it out. He said nothing. His face, in the wavering light, was all sharp angles and shadows. It was a weathered face, browned by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of distance and hardship. His eyes were dark and unreadable. She stared at the cup, then at him, her fear a palpable thing in the small room. He simply waited, his patience as vast and silent as the landscape outside. Finally, her thirst won out over her fear. She reached with a trembling hand, the one that ached the least, and took the cup. It was a weak, salty broth, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was warmth and life. He took the empty cup and returned to the hearth. The silence stretched, broken only by the fire and the wind. The cabin was a single, small room, Spartan but meticulously clean. Besides her cot and the fireplace, there was a small, sturdy table with one chair, a few shelves holding tins and clay jars, and on the floor in the far corner, a simple bedroll of blankets and furs that was clearly his. Everything had a place. There was no clutter, no waste. My husband, she finally managed to whisper, her voice a dry, raw rasp. The others? He looked at her over his shoulder, his expression unchanging. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He turned back to the fire and added a log, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, as if unused to speaking. "Storm is not done," he said. "Nothing to do but wait." And that was all. He did not offer false hope or comforting lies. He gave her only the plain, hard truth. They were trapped. She was at his mercy. The next few days were a blur of pain and fevered dreams. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, was fighting a desperate battle. The frostbite in her hands and feet was severe, the flesh swollen and discolored. At times, she was delirious, lost in a terrifying landscape of swirling snow, and Alistair's angry, shouting face. Through it all, Cale was a constant, quiet presence. He tended to her with a surprising gentleness. He had a knowledge of things she had never imagined, a wisdom that came not from books, but from the earth itself. He gathered snow and melted it for water. He went out into the storm. She could hear the door open and close, followed by a blast of frigid air, and returned with bundles of herbs and roots he had somehow found beneath the snow. He brewed them into a dark, bitter-smelling poultice, which he spread carefully onto clean strips of cloth and used to bind her hands and feet. His touch was the most startling thing of all. It was completely impersonal, the practical touch of a man tending to an injured animal. Yet it was profoundly decent. It was gentle. It was careful. It held no hint of ownership, no trace of the cold, proprietary way Alistair would take her arm, his fingers pressing into her flesh as if to remind her that she belonged to him during those long, painful hours. As this silent stranger cared for her with a tenderness she had never known, the first thick walls of her fear began to crack and crumble. She was completely vulnerable, utterly reliant on him for her very life, and he had shown her nothing but quiet, solemn decency. As the fever broke and the worst of the pain subsided, the days settled into a strange, monotonous routine dictated entirely by survival. Time was measured by the feeding of the fire. The world was measured by the four walls of the cabin. Each morning, Cale would pull on his heavy coat and snowshoes and disappear into the white maelstrom for hours. He always came back, a silent specter emerging from the blizzard, carrying 2 or 3 snowshoe hares or a brace of ptarmigan, their white feathers stark against his dark clothes. Ilara, still weak but clear-headed now, would watch him from the cot. She watched the fluid, efficient skill with which he skinned a rabbit, leaving a perfect pelt that he would later stretch and treat. She watched the immense patience in his hands as he sat by the fire, relacing a snowshoe with strips of wet rawhide. Sometimes he would simply sit and stare into the flames, and in those moments, she saw the deep, ingrained loneliness in his face. It was in the set of his jaw, in the distant focus of his dark eyes. He was a man who had made a companion of solitude. She began to notice the few personal items that shared the cabin with him. On a small shelf above his bedroll sat a single, worn book. One afternoon, when he was outside, she hobbled over to look at it. It was a book of poetry. The pages were soft and dog-eared from countless readings. Near it lay a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its head cocked as if listening, its form so lifelike it seemed it might take flight. These were not the possessions of a savage. They were the treasures of a man with a hidden, quiet soul. One morning, the routine was broken by a terrible stillness. Cale had gone out at dawn, as usual, to check on his horse. He had built a small lean-to against the side of the cabin for the Mustang, packing it with pine boughs to try and keep the wind at bay. Ilara was awake when he came back inside. He did not carry any game. He closed the door softly and stood with his back to it, his head bowed. The silence in the cabin was suddenly immense, heavier than the snow. She saw the clenching of the muscle in his jaw, the stark hollowness that had entered his eyes. He did not say a word. He went to a corner, took up a heavy iron pick and a shovel, and went back outside. Through the cabin's single, small window, a pane of greased parchment that let in a dim, gray light, she watched him. He worked for hours in the biting wind, his breath pluming in the air. He was digging a grave in the frozen ground near the lean-to, a task of back-breaking, heart-breaking labor. The prolonged, brutal cold had been too much even for the hardy Mustang. His horse, his only companion in this vast wilderness, his only true link to the world beyond these mountains, was gone. Ilara watched him wrestle a large, canvas-wrapped shape into the hole and begin to fill it, his movements stiff with a grief too profound for tears. And in that moment, watching this lonely man bury his only friend, a powerful, unspoken bond formed between them. They were not just trapped by the storm anymore. They were truly, completely cut off from the world. The stark gravity of their situation settled over her, a cold and certain truth. They had nothing and no one but each other. As her strength returned, Ilara could no longer bear to be idle. She found her small reticule among the few possessions he had salvaged from the wreck of the wagon. Inside was a small sewing kit. One of his shirts, a coarse flannel garment, had a long tear in the sleeve. One afternoon, as he sat mending a trap, she gestured toward it. "May I?" she asked, her voice still quiet from disuse. He looked from her face to the shirt, then gave a single, curt nod. She took it, threaded a needle, and began to sew. Her stitches were small, fine, and perfectly even, a skill learned during long, tedious afternoons in Boston. It was an accomplishment of a lady. a useless art in this world, and yet, here it was, a practical thing. He stopped his work and watched her, his face unreadable as her slender, pale fingers, still tender from the frostbite, moved with a delicate precision. She began to take on other small tasks. She learned the rhythm of the fire, when to add a log to keep a steady heat. She learned to melt snow in the big kettle for their water. A constant, necessary chore. These small, shared duties began to build a new rhythm, not of a man and his patient, but of two people sharing a space, a life. A fragile domesticity began to bloom in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The nights were the hardest. The fire, which seemed so powerful during the day, felt like a small, inadequate defense against the vast, crushing cold of the mountain nights. A deep, penetrating chill would seep through the log walls, a constant, invasive presence that found its way into their very bones. They slept in their separate spaces, she on the cot, he in his bedroll across the room, but the cold was a third person in the cabin with them, a relentless and impartial enemy. One night, the temperature dropped to a level that felt truly life-threatening. The wind outside stopped its howling and fell to a dead, eerie silence. The cold intensified, pressing in on the small cabin with a terrifying weight. The fire was burning high, but it was not enough. Alara lay on her cot, buried under every blanket they had, and shivered. It was not the gentle trembling of being chilled. It was a violent, uncontrollable shaking that rattled her teeth and convulsed her entire body. She was losing the fight, and she knew it. Cale had been sitting by the fire, his back to her. But he was not a man who missed things. He heard the chattering of her teeth, saw the violent shuddering of the buffalo hide that covered her. He turned and watched her for a long moment, his face grim in the firelight. He knew what was happening. Her body was spending its last reserves of energy trying to generate heat, and it was a losing battle. Soon the shivering would stop, and a deadly lethargy would take its place. He had seen it happen to men before. He stood up. The internal conflict was plain on his face, a struggle between instinct and the ingrained rules of a world that had never treated him kindly. In that world, she was a white woman, a lady, another man's wife. He was a man of mixed blood, an outcast. To touch her, to even suggest what needed to be done, was a transgression so profound it could be punished by a rope. But that world was miles and a lifetime away. In here, inside these four walls, the only law was survival, and survival was a cruel, unsentimental master. He walked over to her cot. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight. She stopped shivering for a moment, her body going still with a different kind of fear. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light. His voice was low and rough, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "You'll freeze without me." It was not a question. It was not a suggestion or a seduction. It was a statement of fact, a grim warning. She just stared at him, her mind a riot of confusion and ingrained propriety. He knelt beside the cot, his gaze direct and stripped of all artifice. "The fire is not enough," he said, his voice flat. "Body heat, it is the only way." The moment hung in the frigid air, charged with a terrifying tension. Every lesson of her upbringing, every rule of a society that defined her worth by her purity and her station, screamed at her to refuse, to recoil in horror. But the cold was a more immediate and powerful truth than any social convention. It was death, waiting patiently in the corners of the room. She looked into his eyes and saw no hint of predation, no flicker of desire. She saw only a stark, brutal honesty. It was a moment of pure, terrifying choice between the rules that had governed her life and life itself. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He stood and pulled back the heavy buffalo hide. He did not remove his boots or his heavy wool trousers and shirt. He lay down on the narrow cot beside her, keeping a careful, deliberate distance between their bodies. But the space was small, designed for one person, and their proximity was unavoidable. He reached and pulled the heavy hide over both of them, creating a small pocket of shared air in the vast, freezing night. The first few minutes were incredibly awkward and tense. Ilara lay rigid, her body as stiff as a board, her mind screaming at the sheer, unthinkable intimacy of the act. She could feel the solid warmth of him beside her, smell the faint, clean scent of pine smoke and cold air that clung to his clothes. He was as still as stone, his breathing slow and even, making himself as small and non-threatening as he possibly could. He was a wall of warmth, nothing more. Slowly, inevitably, the simple physics of survival took over. The heat radiating from his body began to seep into hers, a slow, life-giving tide. It pushed back the invasive chill, quieting the violent shivers that had racked her frame. Her muscles, which had been knotted with cold and tension, began to relax. It was a primal, essential warmth, the kind one living thing gives to another in the face of a greater cold. Exhausted from her body's long fight and feeling, for the first time in weeks, a profound sense of safety, her conscious mind finally surrendered. Her body, however, had its own wisdom. In the deep currents of her sleep, it betrayed all her waking fears and conventions, seeking the source of the life-saving heat. She unconsciously curled closer, her movements small and instinctive, until her head came to rest on his shoulder and her arm lay across his chest. Cale remained awake for a long time, staring up at the dark, timbered ceiling. He did not move. He simply lay there, feeling the light, trusting weight of her against him. A profound and dangerous intimacy that had just saved her life. Their shared breath misted in the frigid air of the cabin. Outside, the storm raged on, a symphony of chaos and ice. But inside, a different kind of storm, one of quiet, terrifying, and wondrous complexity, was just beginning. Ilara woke to the memory of warmth. She had opened her eyes before dawn, her mind still fuzzy with sleep, to find herself curled against Cale's solid form, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. The realization had sent a jolt through her, part shame, part a strange, unsettling comfort. She had pulled away then, retreating to her own side of the narrow cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. When the pale, gray light of morning finally filtered through the parchment window, they rose and moved about the small cabin with a new, profound awareness of each other, a quiet tension that was as thick as the log walls. The formal distance between them had been irrevocably broken. The act of sharing warmth, born of a desperate necessity, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They avoided each other's eyes, the silence between them no longer one of simple mistrust, but of a deep, unspoken acknowledgement. 100 things were left unsaid in the small spaces between the crackle of the fire and the scrape of a spoon against a tin bowl. The cabin, which had been a mere shelter from the storm, was beginning to feel like a shared world, a tiny island of existence with its own fragile peace and its own unspoken rules. As the days turned into a week, and then another, Ilara's body healed with a speed that surprised her. The last of the fever left her, and the angry, swollen flesh of her hands and feet slowly returned to normal, leaving behind only a faint, tender ache. But the more profound change was happening within her. Freed from the constant, oppressive judgment of her husband and the rigid expectations of Boston society, the layers of her former self began to peel away. The timid, hesitant woman who had arrived in these mountains was being burned away by the simple, clarifying fire of survival. She began to speak more, her voice, once a timid whisper, gaining a new confidence and clarity. She found herself filled with a boundless curiosity about the world outside the cabin door. "How do you know which way is north when you cannot see the sun?" she asked one afternoon, watching him carve a new handle for his knife. He paused, considering the question. "You feel the wind," he said, his voice still quiet, but less guarded than before. It has a grain, a direction, and the trees, the moss grows thickest on the side that gets the least sun. She would ask him about the animals, about the seasons, about the stars. She learned that a certain kind of cloud, clinging to the high peaks, meant more snow was coming. She learned to tell the delicate, hopping track of a snowshoe hare from the purposeful, single-file line of a fox. He would answer her questions with a startling directness, his knowledge of the world a thing of deep, practical beauty. And in her genuine curiosity, her complete lack of the condescension he had come to expect from the white world, he began, slowly, to open up. He never offered more than she asked for, but his brief answers became fuller, coaxed from him by the simple act of being listened to. One evening, the storm outside seemed to find a new fury, the wind shrieking like a banshee around the eaves of the cabin. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel both intimate and intensely isolated. They had eaten a meal of roasted ptarmigan, and a comfortable silence had settled between them. Alara found herself speaking before she had even consciously decided to. "In Boston," she began, her voice soft. "My father's house had a small room at the back, a conservatory filled with plants and light. That was my favorite place." Cale looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He waited. "I used to paint," she confessed, the words feeling strange and rusty on her tongue. "Watercolors, mostly flowers, and the birds in the garden. I loved the way you could mix the colors, the way you could make something on the paper that was alive. It was the only time I felt truly myself." She stared into the flames, seeing the ghosts of those bright, wet colors. "When I was to be married, my mother told me it was no longer a suitable pastime. A married woman, a lady of station, had duties. She was to manage a household, not to dabble in messy, childish hobbies. So I packed my paints away." She had not realized she was crying until a tear traced a hot path down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. "My marriage, it was not for love. My father had lost nearly everything. Mr. Sterling's offer saved us from ruin. I was part of the transaction." The words came tumbling out now, a confession she had never dared to speak aloud. "I felt like a piece of property he had acquired, something to be displayed, to be managed. My deepest fear was of the life ahead of me, a beautiful house, fine dresses, endless dinner parties, a life of quiet, gilded suffocation. I was afraid I would simply disappear." She wept then, not for the cold or the fear of the last few weeks, but for the girl with the paintbrushes, the girl who had been packed away like a childish hobby. Cale did not move. He did not speak. He simply sat and listened, his quiet, steady presence a balm, a silent testament that she was seen, that her sorrow was real. He offered no judgment, only the profound comfort of being heard. After a long time, when her tears had subsided, he finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "My father was a white man," he said, staring into the fire as if seeing a past of his own. "A trapper. He taught me how to read the land, how to set a snare. He had a laugh that used to shake the trees." Cale's mouth tightened. "One spring, he went to sell his furs and he never came back, just disappeared." He shifted, picking up a twig and feeding it to the flames. "My mother was Ute. Her people called her Mourning Dove. She taught me about the herbs that heal, the stories of the stars. She taught me that the mountains have a spirit. After my father was gone, we lived with her people for a time, but then the soldiers came. They said the tribe was on land that belonged to the government now. There was a fight. They saw her as nothing more than a savage. They killed her while she was gathering roots by the stream." The pain in his voice was a raw, ancient thing. Alara felt her own breath catch in her throat. "I have lived between two worlds my entire life," he said, his voice flat with a lifetime of resignation. "And I belong to neither. To the white men in the towns, I am a redskin, an outcast not to be trusted. to some of the tribes. My father's blood makes me an outsider, too. So I came here." He gestured with his hand to the dark, parchment window, to the raging storm beyond. "The land does not care what blood you have. It does not judge you. It only asks that you learn its ways and respect its power. It is the only place I have ever felt at peace." It was a confession of immense vulnerability, a bearing of the deep well of pain and injustice that had shaped his entire existence. In his story, Alara heard an echo of her own feelings of being trapped, of being judged and defined by others. Without thinking, she reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his. His skin was rough and calloused, but warm. He flinched almost imperceptibly at the contact, then went still, his gaze fixed on her small, pale hand resting on his own. It was a simple gesture, a bridge across the chasm of their different lives, but it communicated more than words ever could. It was in that shared, fragile moment of vulnerability, with the storm wailing outside and the fire crackling between them, that their love truly took root. In the days that followed, the air in the cabin grew thick with an unspoken desire. It was a natural and inevitable thing, a consequence of their deepening emotional intimacy and their constant, unavoidable physical proximity. It was in the way their hands would brush as he passed her a piece of roasted meat, sending a jolt through her that was as sharp as a spark from the fire. It was in the way he would sometimes pause in his work to watch her as she sat by the hearth, combing out her long, dark hair, the firelight turning it to a river of molten copper. It was in the way she found herself studying the strong lines of his back as he chopped wood outside the window, the easy, powerful grace of his movements. The tension was a silent current running through the very air they breathed, a palpable force that drew them inexorably closer. It happened on another night of life-threatening cold. They lay side by side on the narrow cot, the heavy buffalo hide drawn over them, a familiar ritual now. But this time, it was different. When Alara looked at him in the dim, flickering light, she no longer felt a shred of fear, only a profound, aching yearning that seemed to start deep in her soul. He must have seen it in her eyes. He turned his head on the rough pillow, his gaze meeting hers. The silence in the cabin was absolute, save for the whisper of their own breathing. He slowly lifted his hand, the one she had touched, and brought it to her face. His fingers were hesitant, almost reverent, as they brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. He let his hand rest there, his calloused thumb stroking her skin with an impossible gentleness. It was not a demand. It was a question. She gave him her answer. She leaned into his touch, a small, trusting movement, and closed her eyes. She felt his breath, warm against her lips, and then the soft, tentative pressure of his mouth on hers. Their first kiss was not a thing of passion, but of discovery. It was gentle, searching, a quiet conversation in a language neither of them had ever spoken before. It deepened slowly, fueled by weeks of unspoken emotion, of shared hardship, of a desperate, primal need to connect with the only other human being in their frozen world. He pulled her closer, and there was no awkwardness now, only the rightness of it. Their love-making was a quiet, sacred thing, an act of deep emotional surrender. For Alara, it was a revelation. It was the first time in her life she had been touched with true reverence, the first time she had experienced an intimacy that was not about duty or submission, but about a true and equal meeting of souls. In his arms, she felt not possessed, but found, for Cale, as he held her, as he lost himself in the softness of her skin and the quiet sighs that escaped her lips. It was the end of a lifetime of profound, crushing loneliness. It was the discovery of a warmth that could hold back not just the cold of the mountains, but the cold of the world. They found in each other a sanctuary, a quiet, holy place where there were no names, no pasts, no judgments, only two souls clinging to each other in the heart of a great and terrible storm. In the days that followed, they existed in a stolen paradise. They were Adam and Eve in a frozen Eden, the cabin their entire world. They found a new, easy rhythm, filled with small moments of grace. They laughed together, a sound Alara realized she had not truly made in years, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. He took her outside one clear, cold afternoon and taught her how to use the small rifle he kept for hunting grouse. "Breathe out slow," he told her, his voice a low murmur by her ear as he helped her steady the barrel. "Become still, like the mountain." When she finally fired it, the recoil jarring her shoulder, and hit the pine knot he had pointed out, a fierce pride bloomed in her chest. She discovered a steadiness in herself, a core of strength she never knew she possessed. In the evenings, she would read to him from his worn book of poetry. Her voice, clear and melodic, filled the small cabin, the elegant words of poets from a world away weaving a strange and beautiful magic in the firelight. He would listen, his head tilted, his expression rapt, as if hearing the words for the very first time. They functioned as a true partnership. The wilderness outside was still a constant threat, but inside the walls of the small cabin, they had built a world that was whole and beautiful and entirely their own. But the dark, tragic undertone of their existence was never far away. They both knew, in the quiet, honest parts of their hearts, that this was temporary. The world outside, the world of Alistair Sterling, of laws and towns and brutal prejudice, still existed. Sometimes, a shadow would pass over Cale's face as he stared into the fire, and Alara knew he was thinking of the sheer impossibility of their situation. One afternoon, he came back from checking his trap lines with a new grimness in his eyes. He was quiet and withdrawn for the rest of the day. He did not tell her that he had found, in a snow-filled gully a mile from the cabin, the frozen, half-eaten remains of one of Alistair's outriders. The wolves had found the man first. Cale had taken the time to bury what was left of him under a cairn of heavy stones, a grim messenger from the world they had tried to forget. He did not need to tell her the details. She saw the change in him, felt the return of a harsh, cold reality. Their fragile bubble had been pricked. The end of the storm came without warning. For weeks, the wind had been a constant, raging presence. Then one morning, they woke to a strange and unfamiliar silence. It was a silence so deep and profound it was almost deafening. The wind had stopped. Cale rose and went to the small, grimy window. A single, weak sliver of pale, watery sunlight was filtering through the parchment, cutting a bright line across the cabin floor. The storm was over. He turned and looked at Alara. For a single, fleeting moment, their eyes met with a look of pure, unadulterated joy, but it was instantly replaced by something else, a shared, unspoken fear that was as cold as the ice outside. The end of the storm meant the beginning of the end for their time together. The path to the outside world was now open, and the outside world, she knew, was coming for them. The silence that followed the storm was a living thing, a presence more profound and unnerving than the weeks of relentless howling. It pressed in on the small cabin, a deafening quiet that seemed to amplify the frantic beating of Alara's own heart. Outside, the world had been reborn in a harsh and brilliant light. The sun, a stranger for what felt like a lifetime, struck the endless expanse of new snow, turning the landscape into a blinding sheet of diamonds. It was a scene of pristine, terrifying beauty. The snow lay in immense drifts, reshaping the very contours of the mountains, burying the familiar world under a thick, clean blanket of white. The feeling in the cabin was not one of relief. It was a deep, cold dread. Their sanctuary was no longer sealed. The storm that had been their prison had also been their protector. Now, the way was open. Cale moved to the door and lifted the heavy wooden bar that had secured it against the blizzard. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silence. He pulled the thick plank door inward, and the light flooded the dim cabin, so bright it made them both flinch and raise a hand to their eyes. They stood for a moment on the threshold, their breath pluming in the frigid, still air. The path to the outside world was open, and with it, the path for the outside world to find them. The next morning, Cale left at dawn, his face set in grim lines. He was gone for hours, and Alara passed the time in a state of gnawing anxiety, pacing the small confines of the cabin that had once felt like a world but now felt like a cage. When he finally returned, she saw at once that he had found something. The grimness on his face had hardened into a stark, bleak certainty. He had followed the line of the ravine down to where the wagon had come to rest. It was almost completely buried, a splintered ribcage of wood sticking up from the deep snow. The scene, he told her in a low, flat voice, was one of absolute devastation. The mules were gone, likely swept away or buried deep, but he had found the drivers, Jeb and Silas. They were frozen solid, perfectly preserved by the ice, their faces masks of their final, terrified moments. He had done what he could, covering them with stones, a hasty and inadequate burial. "And Alistair?" she asked, her voice a thin thread of sound. She was not sure what answer she was hoping for. "Nothing," Cale said, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her. "No sign of him or his horse. The snow is too deep. He could be buried anywhere between here and the trail. Or," he let the word hang in the air between them, heavy and unspoken, "or he could have survived." The ambiguity of it was a new kind of torture. Was her husband a frozen corpse somewhere under the snow? His ambition and arrogance finally laid low by the nature he despised? Or had he, through that same ruthless determination, somehow escaped? The uncertainty settled over them, a constant, chilling presence. Alistair's fate was a ghost that now haunted the small cabin. In the days that followed, Alara's mind became a battlefield, a part of her, a deeply conditioned part that still answered to the name Mrs. Alistair Sterling felt a shameful flicker of hope that he was alive. The thought of rescue, of being returned to civilization, to a world of hot baths and clean sheets and predictable days, was a powerful lure. She could go back. She could resume her life. And this time, this terrifying, beautiful, impossible time in the mountains would become nothing more than a fever dream, a secret she would carry to her grave. But each time that thought arose, it was followed by a wave of revulsion so strong it made her physically ill. A life with Alistair. The thought was a death sentence. It would mean returning to his cold hands, his scent of disapproval, his complete and utter ownership of her. It would mean the death of this new person she had become, this woman who could mend a shirt and fire a rifle and feel the grain of the wind. Her love for Cale was so tangled up with her own awakening that the idea of leaving him felt like a physical amputation, the tearing away of a vital part of herself. She was torn between the ghost of her duty and the vibrant, breathing reality of her love. Cale, too, was changed. The quiet peace he had found with her in their isolation was gone, replaced by a tense and watchful vigilance. He became more withdrawn, his silences longer, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He knew the ways of this land, but he also knew the ways of the men who traveled it. He knew what they would think and what they would do. He began to make practical preparations, not for a rescue, but for a confrontation. Alara watched as he sat by the fire for an entire evening, meticulously cleaning his rifle. The soft click of oiled metal, a new, ominous sound in their shared quiet. He sharpened his knives on a whetstone until their edges were like razors. He took a careful inventory of their dwindling supplies, calculating how long they could last if they had to leave the cabin. His lessons in survival took on a new urgency. He was no longer just sharing his knowledge. He was arming her. He showed her how to build a small fire in a pit, using dry wood that produced almost no smoke, a fire that could warm them without signaling their position from miles away. He took her into the snow-laden trees and taught her how to move, placing her feet on his snowshoes, showing her how to walk without snapping a twig, how to become a shadow among other shadows. He was preparing her for a future where they might have to run, a future where silence and invisibility were the only things that might keep them alive. Nearly a week after the storm had broken, it happened. Cale was on the small rise behind the cabin, checking a snare line, when he suddenly went still. Ilara, who had been gathering firewood below, saw the change in his posture and her heart went cold. He raised a hand, signaling for her to stay where she was, then dropped to his belly, crawling to the crest of the ridge. After a long moment, he motioned for her to join him. She scrambled up the slope, her lungs burning in the thin air. She lay beside him in the snow, peering over the ridge. In the valley far below, a line of dark figures was moving slowly across the vast expanse of white. There were 5 of them, all on horseback, their progress slow and difficult in the deep snow. A search party. They watched in silence as the men advanced, representatives of the world of law and order, of towns and judgment. Ilara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She knew, with a terrible certainty, how those men would see this scene if they found it. They would not see a man who had saved her life, who had tended to her with gentle hands and shared his last scraps of food. They would see a woman of quality, the wife of a rich and important man. And they would see Cale. They would see a half-Ute wanderer, a savage from the territories who had taken her, who had used her. Her survival would be a miracle. His part in it would be a crime. They lay there for what felt like an eternity, watching the slow, inexorable approach of the world they had left behind. When the party was close enough that they could hear the faint jingle of a harness on the cold, clear air, Cale turned to her. His face was a mask, his dark eyes betraying nothing of the turmoil she knew must be raging inside him. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and steady, "you have a choice to make." She looked at him, confused, and he gestured down toward the valley. "I can take you down there. I can lead you to them. You can tell them you were lost, that you survived on your own. You can go back to your life. No one ever has to know about me. I will disappear back into these mountains. You will be safe." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was offering her an escape. He was offering to erase himself from her life, to take on the burden of their shared secret and carry it away into his solitude. All for her. It was a testament to his love so profound, so utterly selfless, that it shattered the last remnants of the woman she had once been. He was willing to sacrifice his own happiness, to return to his crushing loneliness, to ensure her safety from the very danger that he represented. Her decision was the emotional climax of her life. She looked from the dark, distant figures of the search party, symbols of the world that had tried to suffocate her, and then turned her gaze to the face of the man beside her, the man who had carried her through a blizzard, who had saved her from freezing, who had shown her a tenderness she had never imagined, the man who had listened to her secrets and shared his own scars, who had taught her not just how to survive, but how to truly live. She thought of Alistair's cold, possessive hands, of the endless, empty drawing rooms, of the gilded cage that awaited her. She realized, with a clarity that was as sharp and bright as the winter sun, that returning to that life would be a deeper and more profound kind of freezing than the one she had almost suffered in the snow. It would be the freezing of the soul. She reached out and laid her gloved hand on his arm. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, waiting. "My life is not back there," she said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. "It is here, with you." In that moment, she was not Mrs. Alistair Sterling of Boston. She was Ilara, and she was free. She had fully and consciously rejected her past, and in its place, she had chosen a dangerous, uncertain, and beautiful future with him. It was an act of rebellion. It was an act of profound and terrifying love. A look of something, relief, sorrow, a grim acceptance, passed across his face. He gave a single, sharp nod. Their decision was made. They did not go back to the cabin. It was too exposed, too easily found. As the search party made camp in the valley below, Ilara and Cale slipped away like ghosts, moving north, deeper into the mountains, their small sanctuary. The place where they had fallen in love was now a liability, a place of memory they had to abandon. Cale led them to a place he knew of, a hidden system of shallow caves set high on the face of a granite cliff, its entrance shielded by a thick growth of ancient, gnarled pines. This period was fraught with a new kind of hardship. The raw, desperate romance of the cabin gave way to the harsh, grinding reality of being fugitives. They were constantly cold, their meager supplies dwindling. The fear of discovery was a constant companion, a knot of ice in Alara's stomach that never fully dissolved. They moved in silence, spoke in whispers, and started at every snap of a twig, every cry of a distant bird. Their love, which had felt so pure and right in the isolation of the cabin, was now, in the eyes of the world, a crime. One evening, huddled together for warmth in the back of the cold, damp cave, the dark tragedy of their situation descended upon Alara with its full, crushing weight. "Cale," she whispered into the darkness. "What would happen if they found us?" He was silent for a long time, and she could feel the tension in his body. His response, when it came, was grim and utterly honest. "To you, they would praise your courage. They would call you a hero for surviving. They would take you back to your husband and your fine house." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower. "To me, they would call me a monster, and they would find the tallest tree they could and hang me from it for touching you." The stark, brutal injustice of his words stole the air from her lungs. This was the law of the world they had run from, a world that would celebrate her and murder him for the exact same reason, because they loved each other. The reality of it did not push them apart. It solidified their bond, forging it into something hard and unbreakable, a shared determination to remain free, or to die trying. The end of the immediate threat came 2 days later. They were huddled in the cave, chewing on strips of dried rabbit, when they heard the sounds, voices, the crunch of snowshoes on snow. The party was passing on the trail directly below their hiding place. They froze, barely daring to breathe, their bodies pressed back into the deepest shadows of the rock. The men's voices drifted up, clear on the cold air. "It is a fool's errand, I tell you," one voice grumbled. "The whole lot of them went over that cliff. No one could survive that fall, let alone the storm that followed. We are risking our own necks for a bunch of frozen corpses." "Sterling's partners are paying well," another voice answered. "But you are right. Another day of this, and we will be the ones needing a search party. We will give it till noon. Then we turn back. They are all dead. We will tell them we found the wagon, and that is the end of it." The sounds faded as the men moved on down the trail, leaving Alara and Cale alone in the resounding silence once more. They were safe, for now. But as they looked at each other in the dim light of the cave, they both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The world had not forgotten them, and one man in particular, a man of cold, hard pride and a furious sense of ownership, was not the type to give up on what he considered his. The weeks that followed their return to the cabin were a quiet, fragile gift. The deep silence of the high country, once a source of dread, became a comforting blanket. They saw no more signs of the search party, and a false, hopeful sense of security began to settle over them. They moved back into the cabin, reclaiming the small space that had been their crucible and their sanctuary. Life settled into a rhythm not of survival, but of living. Spring began to touch the mountains, not with a sudden burst of life, but with a slow, grudging thaw. The great monolithic drifts of snow began to shrink, weeping meltwater that trickled in new, temporary streams down the slopes. Patches of dark, damp earth appeared on the forest floor, and with them came the first, tentative signs of green. A new scent was on the air, the smell of wet soil and dormant life awakening. This change in the season mirrored a glimmer of hope that had taken root in their hearts. In the evenings, sitting before the fire, they began to speak of the future. Their words were quiet, almost whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile dream. Cale told her of valleys to the north, places so remote and walled in by impassable peaks that the world of men and their laws simply did not exist. He spoke of building a new life there, a place where they would be judged only by the strength of their hands and the truth in their hearts. Ilara would listen, her heart swelling with a feeling so potent it was almost painful. She allowed herself to imagine it, a home built by their own hands, a life of shared work and quiet companionship, a life of freedom. This brief, stolen period of peace was a balm on their wounded souls, a moment of impossible grace that made the coming tragedy all the more devastating. The intrusion, when it came, was not a slow approach or a distant warning. It was a sudden, violent shattering of their world. It was a bright, clear afternoon. The air was warmer than it had been in months. Cale was a few hundred yards from the cabin, checking the snares he had set along a game trail. Ilara was inside, humming softly to herself as she kneaded a small lump of dough for bannock bread, a skill he had taught her. She was thinking of the future, of the valley in the north, and for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt a sense of genuine, uncomplicated happiness. The cabin door, which stood ajar to let in the fresh spring air, was kicked open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, shaking the very logs of the cabin. Ilara cried out, spinning around, her hands white with flour. 3 men stood silhouetted against the blinding afternoon light. The 2 in the back were rough-looking strangers, with cold, hard eyes and pistols holstered at their hips. But the man in the front, the man who had kicked open her door, was no stranger. It was Alistair Sterling. He was not dead. He was gaunt, his face thinner and harder than she remembered, with the telltale waxy pallor of frostbite on his ears and the tip of his nose. But his eyes, those cold gray eyes, burned with a hate that was hotter and more terrifying than any fire. He had survived through a force of will that was as ruthless and unforgiving as the blizzard itself. He had, she would learn later, sacrificed one of his men and their horses without a second thought, using the man's life to buy his own, and had finally stumbled into the mining settlement, half dead but entirely unbroken. He had spent the last month recovering, gathering information, and nursing a venomous rage born of profound humiliation. He had not come back to rescue his wife. He had come back to reclaim his property and to exact a terrible revenge. His gaze swept the small, clean cabin, taking in the single cot, the sparse furnishings, and Ilara herself, her dress a simple, mended garment he did not recognize. A sneer of pure disgust twisted his lips. His first words to her were not of concern, not of relief at finding her alive. They were words of possession, dripped in venom. "So this is the sty you have been living in," he said, his voice a low, chilling snarl. "Tell me, did you enjoy playing the savage? Did you enjoy sullying yourself with my property? You worthless whore!" The words were designed to strip her bare, to peel away the strength and dignity she had fought so hard to find and leave her once again the timid, frightened creature he had married. She stood frozen, the shock of his appearance rendering her speechless. He took a step into the cabin, his hired guns fanning out behind him. "Where is he?" Alistair demanded. "Where is the animal you have been rutting with?" At that moment, Cale appeared at the edge of the clearing. He had heard the commotion and was walking toward the cabin, a brace of hares in one hand. He stopped dead when he saw the men, the horses, the open door. He dropped the hares, his hand going instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Ah, there he is now," Alistair said with a chilling softness. Cale walked forward, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of controlled fury. He stepped into a scene of pure menace. The 2 hired guns had their pistols drawn, one aimed at his chest, the other at Ilara. Alistair crossed the room in 2 long strides and seized Ilara's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. The pain was sharp and immediate. "So this is the dog that dares to touch what belongs to me?" Alistair sneered, his eyes fixed on Cale. He began to unleash a torrent of filth, a stream of racist vitriol that polluted the clean mountain air. He called Cale every foul name he could conjure, his words dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who believed utterly in his own superiority. "I am going to kill you, Redskin, but not quickly. First, you are going to watch. You are going to watch as I discipline my wife, as I remind her what happens to property that forgets its place." Something inside Alara snapped. All the fear, all the years of quiet submission, all the ingrained lessons of her upbringing, burned away in a flash of pure, clarifying rage. This man would not break her. He would not defile the one pure and beautiful thing she had ever known. She was no longer the timid woman from Boston. She turned her head and looked Alistair Sterling directly in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as cold and clear as ice. "I am not your property," she said. "I never was." Then she did something the old Alara would never have imagined. She spat in his face. For a heartbeat, Alistair froze, a look of shocked disbelief on his features. Then his face contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained fury, the act of defiance, coming from her, from the quiet, pliable girl he had bought and paid for, enraged him beyond all reason. He drew back his hand and struck her, a vicious, open-handed blow across the face that sent her stumbling backward, her head cracking against the log wall as she fell to the floor. Seeing Alara struck was the trigger that broke Cale's rigid control. He had been standing as still as a statue, a coil of pure, contained rage, knowing that any sudden move could be his last. But the sight of Alistair's hand on her, the sound of the blow, the sight of her falling, it shattered his restraint. He did not lunge at Alistair. With a speed that was almost inhuman, he moved toward the hired gun closest to Alara. The man was overconfident, his attention momentarily diverted by the drama. It was the only opening Cale needed. He slammed the man's gun hand against the doorframe, a sickening crack of bone echoing in the small room. The pistol clattered to the floor. Before the man could even cry out, Cale drove his knife into the man's side, a single, brutal, efficient motion. The cabin erupted into a pandemonium of violence. The second hired gun fired his pistol, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet missed Cale by inches, shattering the parchment window and lodging in the wall behind him. The fight was a desperate, chaotic struggle. Cale was a skilled and powerful fighter, but it was 2 against 1, and one of them had a gun. The narrative of the next few moments was written in the brutal sounds of conflict, the wet thud of fists hitting flesh, the grunts of pain, the scrape of boots on the rough wooden floor. Cale fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, a creature fighting not just for his own life, but for the life of his mate, for the future they had dared to dream of. Alara, her vision swimming, scrambled away from the wall. The rifle, the small rifle Cale had taught her to use, was resting on its pegs by the hearth. Shaking, she pulled it down. She was no marksman, but she did not need to be. She raised the barrel and fired in the direction of the second gunman, who was wrestling with Cale for control of his pistol. The bullet went wide, burying itself in the ceiling. But the shot, the flash, the noise was enough. It was the diversion Cale needed. The gunman flinched, turning his head toward her for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Cale got his hand on the man's pistol, twisted it, and fired. The man crumpled to the floor, a look of surprise on his face. The cabin fell silent, save for the ragged, desperate sound of breathing. Cale stood over the 2 fallen men, bleeding from a cut on his forearm. But the fight was not over. Alistair, who had backed away during the struggle, saw his chance. His face was a mask of pure, twisted spite. He snatched up the pistol that the first gunman had dropped. He did not aim it at Cale. His burning, hate-filled eyes found Alara, who was still on her knees, the rifle clutched in her hands. His logic was the cruel, twisted logic of a tyrant. If he could not have her, if he could not own her, then no one would. She was a broken tool, a flawed piece of property that had defied him. "A broken tool is best discarded," he snarled, and raised the pistol, aiming it directly at her heart. Cale saw it. He saw the shift in Alistair's gaze, the terrible intent in his eyes. Without a thought, without a moment of hesitation, in a final, desperate act of love and protection, he threw himself in front of Alara. The gunshot exploded in the small cabin. The bullet that had been meant for her tore into Cale's left shoulder, the impact spinning him around and throwing him back against her. The pain was immense, a searing, white-hot agony, but he was alive. At that exact same moment, the first hired gun, the one Cale had stabbed, was not as incapacitated as he seemed. With a groan, he rose to one knee, a second knife appearing in his hand. But Cale, even as the bullet slammed into him, was moving. He twisted, using his last ounce of strength and the momentum of his fall, and drove the man's own knife hand back toward his body. The man gasped, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing for the final time. Alistair stood over them, the smoking pistol raised again, his face a mask of triumph. He was ready to finish the job, but in his single-minded obsession with revenge, he had forgotten the laws of the very wilderness he so despised. He had forgotten its treachery. The chaotic struggle had taken them from the center of the cabin to the very edge of the small, rough porch. The spring thaw had been at work there, creating a treacherous patch of slick, unstable mud and melting ice right at the edge of a steep, rocky drop. As Alistair stepped back to steady himself, to take final, perfect aim, his expensive, polished leather boot found that patch of slick mud. His foot slid out from under him. For a comical, horrifying moment, he flailed, his arms pinwheeling in the air, a look of shocked, utter disbelief on his face. The gun fired harmlessly into the blue sky. A wild, high-pitched scream tore from his throat as he tumbled backward over the edge. The scream was cut short by a sickening, final crunch of bone and flesh on the rocks below. Justice had not been served by a hero's hand. It had been served with cold, impartial finality by the very wilderness Alistair Sterling had sought to conquer. An unearthly silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves and the ragged sound of Cale's pained breathing. The aftermath was a shocking, bloody tableau. One hired gun lay dead on the cabin floor. Cale was slumped against her, bleeding profusely from the gunshot wound in his shoulder. And Alistair, her husband, lay broken and still at the bottom of the ravine. Alara's mind, reeling from the sudden, horrific violence, could only focus on one thing: Cale. She gently lowered him to the porch, her hands coming away slick with his blood. Tearing a long strip from the hem of her simple dress, she pressed it hard against the wound, her mind a maelstrom of terror and a fierce, desperate will to save him. They had survived, but the cost was immense, measured in the blood that now stained the floorboards of their small sanctuary, a stark and brutal testament to the fact that the outside world, once it found them, had tried to tear them apart with a savage, unforgiving finality. The silence that fell over the clearing after Alistair's scream was cut short was a heavy, suffocating thing, thicker and colder than the deepest winter snow. It was a silence made of shock and blood and the sudden, brutal absence of violence. Alara and Cale were left amidst the wreckage of their sanctuary. A dead man lay on the floor of the cabin, his blood a dark, obscene stain on the wood. The cold spring air poured in through the broken door, carrying with it the metallic scent of shed blood and the damp smell of the thawing earth. The world narrowed, the chaos of the last few minutes dissolving until Alara could see only one thing: Cale. He was slumped against her, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The makeshift bandage she had pressed to his shoulder was already soaked through with a terrifying amount of red. A clarity born of pure adrenaline and a love so fierce it burned away all fear took hold of her. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a patient. She was the only thing standing between him and death. "We have to get you inside," she said, her voice a low, steady command that she did not recognize as her own. Getting him into the cabin was a monumental struggle. He was a dead weight, his legs refusing to cooperate, and she was a small woman, but she found a strength she did not know she possessed, a raw, desperate power fueled by the terror of losing him. She half dragged, half carried him across the blood-slicked porch and onto his bedroll by the hearth. His wound was ugly, a ragged, dark hole in the muscle of his shoulder, oozing blood. He was already growing feverish, his skin hot and dry to the touch. "The bullet!" he rasped, his eyes clouded with pain. "It has to come out." She knew what she had to do. The knowledge was a cold, hard thing in the pit of her stomach. She took his sharpest skinning knife, the one with the fine, clean edge, and held the blade in the hottest part of the fire, her hand wrapped in a scrap of cloth, until the steel glowed a faint, angry orange. The smell of hot metal filled the cabin, a smell she would associate with this moment for the rest of her life. Cale, drifting in and out of consciousness, guided her with weak, fragmented instructions. "Cut along the grain of the muscle," he whispered. "Feel for it. It will be hard. Against the bone." His trust in her was absolute, a silent, terrible gift. She knelt beside him, took a deep, shuddering breath, and made the first cut. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. The task that followed was a messy, agonizing ordeal. She probed the wound with the sterilized tip of the knife, her hands slick with his blood, her entire being focused on the feel of the metal against his flesh. She could feel his body convulse with each fresh wave of pain, could hear the low, guttural moans he could not suppress. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she felt it, the hard, unyielding shape of the lead ball, lodged deep in the tissue. With a prayer on her lips, she worked the tip of the knife beneath it and pried it free. It fell to the floor with a soft, wet thud. She cleaned the wound as best she could with boiled water and the last of his healing herbs, then packed it and bound it tightly with clean strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat. As she worked, she saw their roles had been completely reversed. She was no longer the helpless woman being saved from the storm. She was his savior, her love the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Their partnership, forged in the quiet desperation of the blizzard, was now sealed in blood and fire. The next task was even grimmer. The bodies, they could not leave them. Alistair and his men would be missed. Questions would be asked. An official search party would be a different thing entirely. A relentless force of law that would not give up until it had answers. The dark, somber work underscored the tragic, bloody cost of their freedom. By the next day, Cale was lucid but incredibly weak, leaning heavily on her, his arms slung over her shoulders. He directed her. Together, they dragged the hired gun's body out of the cabin and into the trees. Then came the awful task of retrieving Alistair from the bottom of the ravine. He was a broken, twisted thing, his arrogance and fury erased, leaving only the empty shell of a man. They wrapped him in a canvas tarp from his own supplies and, with an almost superhuman effort, hauled his body up the slope. They buried them together in a single, deep grave dug into a patch of earth that had finally thawed, a makeshift tomb marked by a simple, anonymous pile of stones. There was no ceremony, no prayers, only a sense of grim, exhausted finality. As Alara stood over the fresh mound of dirt that covered the man who had been her husband, she felt no grief. There was only a profound, sorrowful relief, and a deep, aching guilt for feeling it. She was mourning someone, but it was not Alistair. She was mourning the death of the innocent woman she had once been, a woman from Boston whose hands were clean, a woman who could never have imagined this brutal, bloody outcome. They knew they could not stay. The cabin was a place of ghosts now, its walls stained with violence, its very air tainted by the memory of what had happened. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene, Their dream of a future, the one they had whispered about in the firelight, now required them to disappear completely, to become ghosts themselves. Over the next week, as Cale slowly and painfully recovered his strength, they made their preparations. They worked with a quiet, focused urgency. They salvaged what they could from the supplies Alistair and his men had brought. There was a fine, new rifle, much better than Cale's old one, and several boxes of ammunition. There was a leather pouch filled with coins and bills from Alistair's wallet. The bitter irony of using her dead husband's resources to build a new life with the man he had tried to kill was not lost on Alara. It felt like a small, grim piece of justice, a final turning of the tables. Their departure was a quiet, deliberate act. One morning, with the sun just beginning to touch the highest peaks, they stood before the cabin for the last time. It was the place where she had woken up to a new life, the place where she had discovered her own strength, the place where she had fallen in love. It was also a place of blood and death. Without a word, they turned their backs on it and walked away, not looking back. They headed north, deeper into the mountains, toward the isolated, mythical valleys Cale had spoken of, toward a future they would have to build from nothing but their own hands and their unshakable bond. Their journey was arduous. Cale was still weak from his wound, his left arm bound tightly to his chest. He moved slowly, and every step was a visible effort. The terrain, freed from the grip of the snow, revealed itself to be even more unforgiving. A chaotic landscape of steep ascents, treacherous rock falls, and swift, ice-cold streams, but they relied on each other completely. When his wound pained him, when a wave of feverish dizziness swept over him, she was there, a steadying presence, her slight frame a surprising well of strength for him to lean on, and he, in turn, guided them with his unparalleled knowledge of the land, reading the signs in the trees and the stones, always finding a hidden path, a sheltered place to make camp for the night. Their love, forged in the crucible of survival and violence, was no longer a fragile, blossoming thing. It was a quiet, steady force that sustained them, a silent promise that neither of them would ever be alone again. The narrative of their journey was written in small, quiet moments that shone like stars in the darkness of what they had endured. It was the two of them sharing a piece of dry hardtack while sitting on a high ridge, looking out over a magnificent, untouched vista of mountains and sky that stretched to the end of the world. It was Cale, his voice low in the darkness of a campfire, teaching her the Ute names for the constellations, ancient stories of celestial hunters and spirit bears written in the stars. It was her, reading to him by that same firelight from their one, worn book of poetry, the beautiful, ordered words a strange and comforting counterpoint to the wild, untamed world around them. These moments were tinged with the sadness of all they had lost, all they had been forced to do. But they were also filled with a resilient, hard-won hope. They were creating their own world, their own rules, far from the judgment of others. They knew they could never go back. They were outlaws now, in a sense, not because they had broken the laws of men. The violence that had been visited upon them had been a matter of pure survival, but because their very existence together defied the cruel, unwritten social laws of the time. The justice they had received had been wild and brutal, delivered not by a judge and jury, but by the impartial treachery of a muddy cliff edge. They would have to live with the moral weight of what had happened in that cabin for the rest of their lives. Their love would always be a secret they had to protect. The story does not end with a neat, happy bow. It concludes months later, in the quiet rhythms of an enduring, realistic love. They have found their valley. It is just as Cale had described it, a remote and beautiful place, nestled deep in the northern mountains, a place of green meadows, thick forests, and a clear running stream filled with fish. They have built a new, smaller cabin with their own hands, a home that smells of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke, a home free of ghosts. They are scarred, both of them. Cale's shoulder has healed, but it has left him with a deep, puckered scar and a permanent ache that troubles him when the weather turns cold. And Alara carries her own scars, invisible ones etched onto her soul by the memory of violence and the choices she was forced to make. Their life is not an easy one. It is a life of hard, constant work, of solitude, and of a quiet, perpetual vigilance. The final scene is one of peaceful, late afternoon light. They are sitting on a rough-hewn bench outside their new cabin as the sun begins to set, painting the jagged mountain peaks in breathtaking hues of orange and purple. The vast, wild landscape that was once a source of terror and imprisonment for Alara is now her home, her sanctuary, her freedom. Kale is patiently showing her how to read the tracks of a deer in a patch of soft earth by the stream. Later, by the fire, she will help him sound out the more difficult words in their book of poetry. She leans her head on his good shoulder, and he puts his arm around her, pulling her close. They do not need to speak. Their shared silence is one of complete understanding, of a deep and abiding acceptance of who they are, what they have been through, and what they have become to each other. They have survived the blizzard. They have survived the hatred of men. They have survived the ghosts of their pasts. Their love is not a fairy tale romance, but something infinitely stronger, infinitely more real. A bond forged in fire and ice. A quiet promise to face the vast, indifferent wilderness, and whatever future it may hold. Together, the glimmer of hope has become a steady, sustaining light. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.